We've seen Rome emerge from a simple village of huts on the hills of Rome in the period between 1000 and 675 BCE. And what would later become the Roman Forum was in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE a cemetery known as the Sepulchratum. There were no temples, no large public buildings, and a limited trade network which slowly grew with Greeks in Greece and in the south of Italy. This time is known as the geometric period, or what we've called Archaic I, between 1000 and 750 BCE, and Archaic II, 750 and 675 BCE. In Archaic III, the Orientalizing period, 675 to 600 BCE, the Etruscan civilization developed out of the Villanovans north of Rome and eventually conquered Rome itself. Greek colonies developed in South Italy, and the period is marked by increased trade internationally and the spread of more sophisticated art from Greece and Phoenicia. In Etruria, wealthy noble families emerged and built gigantic tumuli, or dynastic mound tombs. In Archaic IV, between 600 and 500 BCE, as we have seen, the Romans, after a lengthy period of Etruscan rule, restored Latin rule, set up the Roman Republic, and began to develop the Roman Forum and all of its important buildings once the Forum area had been drained and the Cloaca Maxima built. Latin cults such as that of Vesta and Janus, or Janus, the god of beginnings, emerged strongly at this time. In the so-called classical period between 500 and 300 BCE, Athens in Greece became the dominant force early on in the Mediterranean world, but was defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars, ending in 404 BCE. And meanwhile, the Latin rulers of Rome developed the Roman Forum, and it took its traditional shape, featuring temples to Saturn, Castor and Pollux, the cult center to Vesta, the Regia, or office of the Pontifex Maximus, and the government buildings we've seen, including the Curia and the Comitium in the northwest corner. And this brings us to what is known as the Hellenistic period, the middle and later days of the Roman Republic, between 300 and 100 BC, when the Republic began to fall into hard times and end up in rivalries and controversies that would eventually bring it to an end. We're dealing then with the period between 300 and 100 BCE, the time when Rome expanded both north and south and even internationally, becoming the most powerful force in the entire Mediterranean and defeating every enemy in its path, including Greeks, Etruscans, the city-state of Carthage in northeastern Tunisia, in a series of what were termed the Punic Wars, but we'll have more about Carthage in the next lecture. The period of this Middle Republic was a time of nearly constant warfare and expansion, during which time the Romans became the masters of all of Italy, as well as areas as far away as western Anatolia, Numidia in Africa, and Spain. It also witnessed the extraordinary influence of Hellenic and Etruscan culture on Roman art and architecture. During this time came the development of a particularly Roman iconography, but with images based largely on Greek models. This period also saw the construction of temples that fused together ideas from Greeks and Etruscans, the establishment of colonies in far-flung regions, and the development of elegant, profitable villas run by the use of slaves for the benefit of the elites in areas outside of Rome. Once the Romans conquered an area, they would establish settlements of colonies to keep an eye on the potentially rebellious people of the area. A typical example of a Latin colonia, or colony, is Ancedonia, commonly called Cosa, C-O-S-A, located near the Etruscan city-state of Vulci. Founded in 273 BCE to watch out for the recently subjugated Etruscans of the region, it was a fine example of Roman urban planning. The main north streets of it were called Cardines, or Accardo is one of them, C-A-R-D-O. The east-west streets were called Decumani, or a decumanus, D-U-E-C-U-M-A-N-U-S, for one of them. In the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Forum of Cosa was, brought up to date. It became trendy and hip. And a look at Cosa tells us what was hot in architecture among Romans at the time. For example, a large 2-story public hall, or basilica, a covered hall, was constructed, which gave shelter from the rain, hosted public feasts known as epulae, and featured artistic displays. Plus, it had a viewing balcony on its upper story that allowed folks to look out over all the activity in the forum below. The basilica idea had been developed from covered halls used by the Greeks in their agoras, or public meeting places. Another indication of the increasing sophistication of the Romans in architecture was the development of building materials that could get around the Romans' lack of fine marbles and good stone. The Romans developed the use of concrete, mixing lime and sand and water together to fashion a strong mix, even capable of setting up and becoming firm under water, so that it could be used in the harbor of Cosa for breakwaters. The volcanic sand around Pompey, or the town of Puteoli nearby, was particularly valuable and is known today as pozzolana. Construction took the form of making walls which had a concrete core and a facing of pyramidal-shaped stones known as cubilia. The walls were built by first of all laying down vertical wooden pieces, usually some 55 centimeters apart, and then placing a concrete fill inside. A facing of the pyramidal stones was made within the concrete. The flat side of the pyramidal stones was placed up against the vertical wooden sheeting, thus ensuring a flat and uniform facade, while the concrete was allowed to ooze around the pyramidal stones, holding them in place firmly. These pyramidal-shaped stones tapered to a point at the rear, and that allowed them a really good purchase to get into the concrete that was placed within the center of the wall and which was oozing around them. In building structures like this, the cubilia, or the pyramidal-shaped stones, were laid in a regular fashion with concrete around them. And this kind of facing was known as opus incertum, literally irregular or unsure work. And these structures of concrete could actually be built up to even several stories in height. In the early 1st century BCE, the cubilia began to face the walls in a more regular manner and became known as opus reticulatum, which faced the walls in a diagonal arrangement. This started to be used from about 60 BCE on, until the use of bricks became more widespread early in the 1st century CE. These techniques, in combination with big ashlar blocks of masonry, often used to make corners or major stress points, these were the main construction techniques employed in the Middle and later Republic. Outside of Rome in this period, the rest of the Mediterranean increasingly fell under Rome's control, especially Greece, Spain, North Africa, Western Anatolia. Temples in the Greek tradition continued to be built under the Roman masters. At Claros, For example, in western Anatolia, plans were made to build a new temple complex and upgrade the sanctuary to Apollo. It required an elaborate system of quarrying stone far off in the Black Sea, cutting and preparing the stone, and shipping it to the desired site in western Anatolia so that the temple could be constructed. Shipping by sea could be dangerous, as a Hellenistic crew of the later 2nd century BCE was to learn off of Kizilburun, Turkey. All of the pieces being shipped to build the temple complex foundered, perhaps in a storm, and sunk to the bottom of the sea. In order to investigate offshore disasters, the new field of underwater archaeology, pioneered by scholars such as George Bass at Texas A&M University, was developed. Bass's successor, Deborah Carlson, was once my student, I'm proud to say, and now she's come a long way on her own, and she directs the Institute for Nautical Archaeology and the Kizilburun excavations. Ethnoarchaeology has led modern anthropologists to discover fascinating details about ancient daily life, but until fairly recently, only the land could be investigated thoroughly. Now, through the emerging science of underwater archaeology, it is possible to study aspects of Roman life scarcely dreamed of before, and one example is the fascinating shipwreck of Kizilburun. Around 100 BCE, a ship set out from Proconnesus Island with column drums and a Doric capital for the Temple of Apollo at Claros. Off the coast of Kizilburun in Turkey, it sunk. Over 2,000 years later, underwater archaeologist Deborah Carlson arrives to investigate.
The conditions at Kizilburun, both I think for the ancient sailors and the ship that was wrecked there in the 1st century BC, and also for us working there today, can be very hazardous. And the greatest hazard is posed by the Lodos storm, which comes from the south. And these are storms that can erupt very quickly without really any warning and create really very hazardous conditions. So it wasn't uncommon during the Ina excavations between 2005 and 2011 when such a storm came up that we would actually have to evacuate. And because we're diving at depths of 150 feet, we need to keep the team together and keep the team close to our recompression chamber. So we would load everybody on the research vessel, and the research vessel would have to leave camp. So I think those sudden storms, very heavy winds coming from the south, may in fact, I mean, we'll probably never know for sure what happened to this vessel, but I definitely think the sea conditions must have played a significant part. We were fortunate to find a very interesting assemblage of Hellenistic ceramics, which I think will help us date the wreck. We also have some small fragments of glass. We had a bronze coin. These are all small finds within the cargo, but in addition to the 8 column drums and Doric capital, there were a number of marble blocks, newly quarried items, blocks, pillars, pedestals, probably steps, and then a handful of grave stelae, a lovely small unfinished mortar or basin. So it looks to be a cargo of newly quarried marble objects en route to a final destination. Working at a site like Kizilburun is challenging for a number of reasons, but I think foremost among those is because the site is so remote. We are dependent upon ourselves for all the equipment that we need for summer excavation season. There is, of course, the inherent risks of diving, decompression diving, so we're diving 20 minutes for each dive twice a day to depths of 150 feet. We then decompress on pure oxygen. We have a recompression chamber on site, so there are the hazards of both just logistically being there, also the diving, and then of course the weather, which is always a mitigating factor working at a site where many ships have been wrecked. When you're diving down to depths of 150 feet. It almost feels like you're going back centuries with every foot or 10 feet. Once you take on a little bit more responsibility, you worry more and more and more. And so my favorite part of the day is when the last dive is up and I know that everyone is accounted for and everyone is safe. That being said, there's still a tremendous thrill that for me comes in the years that follow the excavation, because there's so many artifacts coming up on any given day. You can't really digest them all, and you can't necessarily appreciate what it is you're looking at until those artifacts have been cleaned and conserved. So it's the study seasons, I think, quite honestly, after the excavation, when you really begin to appreciate the artifacts and the assemblage that you have, and contextualize that and make those connections that we've managed to make between the site of Kizilburun and the Temple of Apollo at Claros, to show how terrestrial and maritime archaeology really can inform one another as disciplines, and how you really need that interface for a meaningful interpretation.
As the Romans conquered their many rivals in the Mediterranean through their effective military organization, Macedonians, Carthaginians, Spaniards, Numidian African Berbers, and so on, all fell in their wake, and they celebrated with great triumphs in Rome. Winning the battle was one thing, but being able to commemorate the victory with monuments, celebrations, and a formal triumph was another. In a time before television networks existed or the internet, statues, monuments, and commemorative paintings had to do the job of spreading the Gloria Exercitus, the glory of the Roman troops. Usually these military paintings do not survive, of course. But during the excavations of Rome's Esquiline Hill necropolis in 1875, near the city gate in the Servian wall known as the Porta Esquilina, an amazing discovery was made in a chamber of a tomb belonging to an important Roman family. Most of the painting had degraded and disappeared, but a small section survived, enough to suggest that there were at least 4 superposed registers featuring scenes from some great war. We still don't know for sure which. The scenes were part of a great narrative story, no doubt celebrating the famous family interred here, and they date to the 3rd or 2nd centuries BCE. Luckily, the Romans often labeled their images, and here we are given the names of 2 men, Quintus Fabius and Marcus Fannius. How were the images to be read? Presumably the viewer proceeded left to right, but the painting may have also been intended to be seen sequentially from top to bottom. In addition, there is a tantalizing red panel that suggests further divisions were made in the work, so that exactly how the scheme was organized, how we were to read it, well, we just don't know for sure. Fannius at the left and Fabius appearing at the right seem to be negotiating. The figure on the left wears a helmet and greaves or shin armor and a short kilt. He reaches out to another warrior carrying a spear that has been set on the ground. In the next panel down, the 2 men appear to be shaking hands while warriors clash to the left, and what may be a group of onlookers in tunics appear stacked in tiers at the right. Below this is an intense battle scene, which is very poorly preserved. So, what is depicted here? It could be the tomb of a famous family. The Fabii are the better-known gens, or family of the 2. But the small size of the tomb and the mediocre quality of the painting may point to the Fanii. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure what battle or war is being depicted. Although the work is not of high quality, the subject matter is for once, though, entirely Roman, and not simply a recycling of Greek or Etruscan imagery. Besides triumphal painting, painting in general in Rome was very popular. Instead of just stuccoing their home interiors white, Romans with any pretense of sophistication covered their interiors with all sorts of elaborate decoration. It started, fairly simply in the 2nd century BCE, with home interiors imitating Greek painting in Greece itself or in Alexandria, Egypt, which had been under Greek dynastic control since the time of the Ptolemies. The last Ptolemy, by the way, was Cleopatra. The wall was divided into 3 parts: a dado or socle at the base, a large middle course, and an upper course that imitated drafted masonry. This tripartite or 3-part wall division was bordered at each stage by a stucco molding. The idea was to make the wall appear to be covered with sumptuous materials, while in fact it was simply stuccoed and painted, and almost everyone could afford it. This was called the masonry style, or first style, and it can be found in abundance, particularly at Pompeii. During this period of time, the Romans began to develop their own sculptural iconography. By the way, when we use the term iconography in art history, we are referring to the way in which images are made, how they look, what they are, how they are detailed. And it is in this period that Roman themes, particularly Roman themes, begin to be depicted, still using the traditional techniques inherited from the Greeks, but now in this period between 300 and 100 BC, now beginning to add their own Roman approach. That is, they began to take the inherited themes from the mainland, from the South Italian Greeks, from the Etruscans, and use them to depict things that were of particular interest to them, their iconography. One example of this is a pediment that has recently been put together and displayed in the Capitoline museums in Rome. This rare discovery was found in Rome during drainage works on Rome's Via San Gregorio on the Capitoline Hill in 1878. And it took a while to put together. They didn't finally get it all together and exhibit it until 2002. It is often identified as coming from a temple to Mars, known to have been built in 132 BCE in this part of Rome. Now, in Etruscan temples, the central pediment was normally closed. Tympanum was there. But here in the Greek style, it is open and filled with sculptures. Unlike temple sculptures in Greece, which were usually of stone, this work, which didn't have such great stone available to it, was done in cheaper terracotta and painted in the Etruscan tradition. It is the earliest example of a closed pediment, Roman sculptural assemblage known. The figures are arranged in a stately and kind of static fashion, and they don't interrelate dramatically. The style is typically Greek of the mid to later 2nd century BC, but the key thing to note is that the scene is uniquely Roman. It's something called a suovetoralia, the sacrifice of a sheep, a goat, and a pig. Surrounding Mars in the center are 2 goddesses. The goddesses, one seated, one standing next to Mars, probably represent Venus, Mars's consort, and Victory, but it is unsure which is which. The seated goddess sits in a rather stiff pose that imitates work in Greece in the 460s BCE, but her thin or attenuated form and her cloak or chiton, cinched below the breasts, is late Hellenistic in date. Dates vary, 150 to 100 BCE for this controversial work, but the date of 132 BCE and the assignation to a temple of Mars, not unreasonable. The whole pediment was gaily painted. Although primitive, it represents a major first step towards a genuinely Roman art. Now, the Romans were known for erecting statues of their own statesmen and the Greek heroes in their government center within the Roman Forum. Were these statues, however, actually lifelike portraits or just stylized impressions of these individuals? When did real portraiture begin? And when did the Romans begin to use it? One piece of Roman sculpture has triggered more scholarly discussion over the past century and a half than any other: the so-called Capitoline Brutus. The disagreement has not only been over the date of this piece, but also over the nationality of the bronze caster who made it, and its identification as Lucius Junius Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic. Known since the mid-16th century, the head sits in a base made during the Renaissance. It is the earliest Roman portrait in bronze that exists, and it bears a striking resemblance to images of Lucius Junius Brutus found on silver denarii, those Roman coins of 54 BCE. Some scholars believe it dates to the later 4th century BCE, a time when Greek sculptors did realistic portraits of individuals, while others place it closer in date to the denarius coin in the mid-1st century BCE. The stately look, the light beard, the thin hair strands seem to be Greek characteristics, but the resemblance to the Roman coin and the ultra-realistic appearance tend towards Roman portraiture of the 1st century BCE. The face has the suppleness and what is called plasticity of form of Greek portraits, but viewed in a certain light it appears angular, with simple geometric treatment of the neck and even the facial structure. The historical Brutus lived in the later 6th century BCE and was a hero of early Rome, and so this work would have to be a fantasy creation in any case, a suggestion of what the early hero of the Roman Republic should have looked like rather than actually did. Did a later member of Brutus's gens or family pose for the portrait, or is it a pure invention, just as the Romans created for their alleged founder hero Aeneas, who was made to look like a bearded Zeus during the Augustan period? The Capitoline Brutus has not yet given up all its secrets. Its deep-set ivory eyes inlaid with dusky blue glass, the diagonal brows, the sharp mouth with its drawn-out faucettes, give the piece a strange rustic charm that contrasts with the smooth and carefully done hair. Some scholars are convinced that it should be dated just this side of 300 BCE, but this opinion can change depending on the light shining on this piece and the angle at which it is viewed. It remains one of art history's most fascinating enigmas. You know, the 1st century BCE was a landmark period in the Roman Republic, which saw the Republic in turmoil and eventually ending due to the rivalries among powerful individual leaders and factions within Rome. By this period, Rome was the major force in the entire Mediterranean world. But there was trouble throughout Italy as non-citizens sought the same kinds of rights and privileges that Roman citizens held. A conflict within Rome itself between rich and poor, military leaders far afield, city leaders, charismatic individuals, all of these conflicts played a part. Well, I've gone into it a bit more in my textbook, but to be sure, the 1st century BCE in politics was extremely complicated in Rome. For example, Julius Caesar was considered a supporter of the lower classes, the populares, the lower group. But he was from one of Rome's most renowned upper-class families. So he was by birth and wealth one of what we would call the optimates, or the chosen ones, the prominent ones. Cicero, the statesman, lawyer, and the writer, was lower class, but he became one of Rome's major leaders in the upper class. And so he reached optimates status. So you see, it's not all just cut and dried. For sure, powerful individuals developed enormous followings, though, among their particular groups. And this just led to open hostility and warfare within Rome itself. And this spread across the Mediterranean. An alliance of Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, fueled by Crassus, and funded by him, he was the wealthiest man in Rome, in 59 BCE, failed to last, and it ended with Caesar in the field being threatened with removal from office by Pompey, who was the leader in Rome at the time. Well, this led Caesar to cross the Rubicon River in northern Italy, leaving Pompey with no option but to flee Rome and to try and wage a war with Caesar that ran all across the Mediterranean. Eventually, Pompey, Caesar's great rival, was sabotaged, and he was assassinated. He was killed in Alexandria, Egypt. Caesar, too, was eventually assassinated in 44 BCE after going too far with his newfound power, claiming to be dictator in perpetuo, perpetually. Caesar dallied with an Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, even having a son with her and bringing her to Rome as his mistress when he already had a faithful wife named Calpurnia. After Caesar's death, it appeared that Mark Antony would become the new darling of the Roman people. A tough general with years of service to his state, he amazingly also dallied with Cleopatra and had offspring with her as well, 3. Cleopatra has been celebrated in plays and movies for decades now, and just what her special hold was over these Roman dynamos isn't known to this day. She was more than a sexual partner. She spoke many languages and was a cunning political manipulator. But she was forced to commit suicide, as did Antony, once again in Alexandria in Egypt, when the Roman people decided they had had enough, and the Romans just united under this new leader, Octavian. He was very effective at rallying Rome and spreading propaganda. Octavian is better known today under the title that the Senate conferred upon him in 27 BC. He's known as Augustus, the revered one. Well, during this age of individualism and the rise of such powerful figures as Lucius Cornelius Sulla in the early part of the 1st century BC, the dictator of Rome from 82 to 79 BC, Pompey the Great, whom we've mentioned, and Julius Caesar, and wealthy Crassus, and Antony, and Octavian, and a host of other nabobs. These were all big leaders of the early and middle and later 1st century BC, and they forced significant and dynamic changes in Rome. And also, this resulted in significant changes in Roman art and architecture. In architecture during the 2nd century BCE and into the 1st century BCE, the Romans developed works that began to establish their own identity. Instead of having the rich marbles of the Greeks, they had to rely on concrete, arches, and vaults primarily. They were able to import marbles and other stones as veneers for their buildings, but they really didn't have an abundance of superb native materials, and they began to build up structures relatively quickly using the concrete, the arches, and the vaults. They also improved the flexibility of the kinds of structures that they were creating, and they were able to use them for a wide variety of purposes. The concrete could be mixed up from lime and sand and fitted with a stone aggregate that was strong and could even set up if poured under water. Sand from the area of Pozzuoli, near Pompeii, south of Rome, was especially valued. In walls, the Romans learned to replace simple rubble or cut stone masonry with the opus incurtum masonry described in my earlier lecture, Lecture 5. Around 80 BCE, this masonry facing was replaced with more regular wall facing of cubilia, or cut pyramidal stones that were laid out in diagonal rows and known as opus reticulatum. In the 1st century AD, this opus reticulatum continued to be used, but often in conjunction with actual bricks, which became popular from the 30s CE. In vaulting, the Romans developed a number of different possibilities, which were all framed out with wooden forms and then poured by gangs of laborers specially organized into guilds, and also using slaves and lower-class workers. They used barrel vaults, which could cover a corridor. If the barrel vault went up a staircase, it was called a ramping vault. And if it went around in a circle, it was what we call an annular vault. Specially built-up vaults, known as pavilion vaults, were able to span single rooms effectively. As the Romans developed their own ritual identity and displayed it through architecture, theater temples of considerable size developed as sanctuaries. One of these combinations of theater and temple was at a place called Praeneste, southeast of Rome. It was a pilgrimage center where you would go if you wanted to pay homage to the goddess Fortuna Primigenia, the goddess patron of your firstborn child. In fact, instead of babbling about it here, why don't we just go there right now and have a look? Beginning in the 2nd century BCE, the Romans began to explore, in a trial and error manner, the possibilities of using concrete instead of fine stone, because the stone was in short supply. The concrete could be shaped into arches and vaults of all sorts by fashioning wood shuttering in the desired form, pouring in the mortar and adding in the stone aggregate. The place to see all of this firsthand is the amazing sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia, Fortune of the Firstborn, at Praeneste, south of Rome. It was a major sanctuary that included a theater and a temple, and in order to experience it, you had to go up some 7 different terraces from the forum area below in the town. And if you were working your way up, you'd probably have a chance to rest down below. There'd be a lovely little stoa or recess where you could have a seat for a while if you're an old person like I am. And then you work your way up one of 2 ramps. Here's a big ramp that goes all the way up this complex. And when you got to the top of it, you would look out and you'd have a remarkable view out practically halfway to the Mediterranean Sea. On the next terrace, we can see that the Romans are using a lot of technological innovation in the early 1st century BCE. If you look here, you see an annular vault, which is like a barrel vault going around in a curve, and it's got recessed coffers in it. They've used traditional Greek Ionic style columns, and up above it they have a curved architrave, and they have an opus incurtum facing, a stone facing of a regular shape with a concrete core to it. And then they have a decorative column with no capitals or bases. This is very Baroque stuff. This sanctuary just goes up terrace after terrace, and you climb and you have this experience of going through almost an initiation with a guide, no doubt, who would take you on each terrace step by step so that you get closer to the true experience of being with the goddess Fortuna Primigenia, of the firstborn. We're almost at the top of the sanctuary now, and when you got near the top, there was a beautiful area, big, broad area. You can still see it indicated here, where you could have pageantry and display all kinds of performances in honor of the goddess. Up at the top of the sanctuary, there was a natural spring and a little round temple, which was replaced in the Renaissance by the Barberini Palace. Today, the spot houses the Archaeological Museum of the site. And from here, you could sit and look out, watch all the performances in front of you, and actually, you could look beyond them to this absolutely incredible vista and view. In the bustling forum area of Praeneste, We can see how they've integrated the past with the present. Behind us are the traces of public buildings and the Basilica of Praeneste, which once had 2 rows of columns in it, and now these have been integrated into a series of modern offices and the Tourist Information Center. In an Italian town like Praeneste, it's not at all uncommon to have the main church or cathedral, the Duomo of the town, to be plunked right directly on an ancient Roman temple. And that's exactly what we have here in Praeneste. In Roman houses of the time, one often followed a particular path. From the entry or fauces, the jaws of the house, which might be guarded by a dog or watchman in a more elaborate home. Once inside, you came to the atrium or the central area, which was open to the sky, letting in light, air, and water, which could be stored in a cistern below the sunken central portion of the floor. Beyond it was a room used for entertaining or transitioning into the garden beyond. This room was called the tablinum, Tablinum. There would also be at least one dining room or triclinium, Triclinium, with couches to recline on and have cut-up food, scissored food, to select with your fingers. There were cubicula, cubicula, or bedrooms for the family, a culina, culina, or kitchen, and a bathroom or a latrinum, latrinum area, which might have necessitated the use of chamber pots, which were quite popular in Rome. Formal latrines with flowing water were available publicly, usually in areas where there were public baths nearby. The houses were decorated with paintings, which had advanced from that first style of simply decorated walls to the more illusionistic, so-called second style, where the wall opened up more considerably into smaller or larger vistas, or sometimes even into a virtual stage. One such example is the so-called Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii, where we see, within a large Roman villa at the edge of Pompeii, a special room, which appears to have belonged to the lady or the domina of the house. It was a special meeting room with walls containing paintings which suggest an initiation ceremony into the cult of Dionysus by a would-be bride of the god. The ceremony is intricately depicted, yet some things are hidden from us. A near-naked child reads the holy word, the hieros logos, while the female priestesses attend and bring cake offerings. Some things are hidden from our eyes, such as perhaps the sacred symbolic phallus of the popular fertility god, which gets unveiled. The purification ceremony continues around the walls of the room and includes ritual whipping, as well as the emergent bride, now purified and ready to take her place with the followers of the god. In the center of the back wall of the room, an apparently inebriated Dionysus reclines in the lap of what may be Ariadne, the bride he once rescued when she had been abandoned by the Greek hero Theseus on the Cycladic island of Naxos. The scene is second style, dates somewhere around 40-30 BCE. The wall has been broken up as a flat surface, and the action now takes place on a stage. The sparse style of the figural detailing suggests artistic influences from the Hellenistic Greek world at the end of the 2nd and into the 1st century BCE. Well, of course, Romans didn't always stay home. Although family life was very important to them, entertainment in the 1st century BCE often consisted of going to see performances in a theater, sometimes classic comedies and tragedies of the Greek world by Sophocles or Aeschylus or Euripides. But the Romans also had their own playwrights and classics from writers such as Terence and Plautus, comedy writers. There were also mime comedies with low-life characters speaking what was off-color dialogue, doing slapstick, singing, dancing, engaging in satire or farce, and not wearing masks, as the Greek actors did. There were also pantomimes, which featured a chorus and dancers who performed interpretations of religious or historical subjects. And these were often spectacles with elaborate set design as well. For a long time in Rome, theaters were considered too Greek, too effeminate, too decadent. But over time, the Roman thirst for entertainment won out, and large theaters were built in the Greek fashion. In the Greek theater, the orchestra, where the chorus performed, was a full circle, and the stage building, or skene, S-K-E-N-E, was an area that was set back from it, with a small proskenion, P-R-O-S-K-E-N-I-O-N, or stage, in front of the backdrop. So skene in the back, and in front of it the proskenion. The theatron, or seating area, was a little wider than a circle. In the Roman theater, this arrangement was, well, tightened up. The size of the orchestra was cut down, not so much used for performances. The theatron was made into a semicircle called the cavea and integrated with the stage area. The stage itself was lowered and broadened out into what is now, or what was called then, a pulpitum, but which resembles our modern stage. Pulpitum is P-U-L-P-I-T-U-M, and it's a long, broad area. In Rome, the first major permanent stone theater was the theater of Pompey. Let's take a really brief look at what that theater of Pompey must have looked like. In Rome, the theater of Pompey the Great was the major entertainment center for plays and pantomimes. As the centuries passed to our modern era, the curve of the cavea, the seating area of the theater, remained and still remains in the modern apartment building there now. And you can go to the Ristorante Costanza, which is located right here in the concrete and barrel-vaulted substructures of the ex-theater of Pompey, and you can dine on fine seafood. During the 1st century BCE, with all of this rise in individualism and the dominance of major egomaniacal figures in Roman politics, portraiture of individuals became increasingly popular. Julius Caesar was the first to blatantly put his own portrait on coins, an act that was considered extremely hubristic at the time. It became fashionable to make death masks of individuals and to have young people wear masks so that ancestors might be at least symbolically present at family or gens-related events. Super-realistic portraits, often made by immigrant Greek sculptors, became a vogue in Rome. The movement came to be known as verism, V-E-R-I-S-M, and it featured a warts-and-all approach to portraying an individual. Every blemish and irregularity of the face was permitted in these astonishing portraits, some of them even made from cast death masks. Some individuals had portraits done that looked somewhat like themselves, but were given added attributes, such as belonged to famous statues or to Greek gods. A general, for example, such as Pompey, was, well, after all, let's face it, not the handsomest man in Rome, and he was a rather down-to-earth man when dealing with other people. But even he could not resist flaring up his hair into a mane that seemed borrowed from portraits of Alexander the Great. It was also a time when a wealthy Roman would demonstrate his sophistication by having copies of important or favorite Greek works of art, or adopted copies of them in his home to display to his house guests. One such example was the so-called Idolino, now in the Archaeological Museum of Florence. It was one of many, many copies that you'd expect to find within a Roman home of some wealth. And so let's just take a brief look at it right now.
The thirst for Greek art continued among the Romans. Beautiful copies of originals by Greek artists were all the rage from the 1st century BCE, and the owners of the growing number of villas and lovely homes wanted to display their own Greek originals made by copyists.
This is another masterpiece of the National Archaeological Museum of Florence. It is the so-called Idolino di Pesaro, the little idol from Pesaro, a city, a Roman city on the Adriatic coast of Italy, where it was found in 1530. The most important part of this statue is the head. The body is quite beautiful, well proportioned, but the head is a kind of masterpiece. It is, as a matter of fact, it is a copy of some lost work by the great sculptor Polykleitos from Argo, one of the major artists in Greek sculpture of the 5th century BC. This statue and another copy, exactly the same, that has been very recently found off the shore of northern Turkey, confirm that there was once, maybe in Athens, the original statue by Polykleitos still standing, from which these two sculptures, one in Turkey and one in Italy, have copied or at least taken inspiration from.
At Archaeosperimentale, a teaching laboratory for the traditional making of objects, Angelo Bartoli demonstrates the creation of bronzes in the ancient manner.
The Romans of this time lit their homes primarily by using clay lamps. A number of these could provide light for an evening dinner party, but olive oil, which came from North Africa by ship, was very expensive. And generally, Romans would go to bed early and get up with the sun quite early. In North Africa, where olive oil was more abundant, people would stay up later. The oil lamp contained a wick, which could be burned and which would continue until the olive oil was all soaked up. Might be interesting to just spend a moment and see how an ancient lamp worked and how it was made. Let's take a look, shall we?
Angelo Bartoli, ethno-archaeologist from Italy's Archaeosperimentale, believes that the ancients rubbed stones together to start a fire in the highly flammable fungus called Phomos fomentarius, a parasitic mushroom that grows on trees. This smoldering mushroom was used to light a stick of wood made from a ferula plant, a perennial which was then used to light the wick of a Roman oil lamp. The oil lamp was made of ceramic, and it had a discus on top that was decorated, sometimes with a wide variety of scenes. The lamp was filled with olive oil, and the wick made of the dried leaves of the plant Verbascus thapsus, or sometimes braided flax.
In the 1st century BCE, glassmaking also came into its own as the Romans made innovations in traditional glass production. To find out about this, we ask an expert glassblower to tell us what the Romans did to change the way glass was produced and appreciated. Watch.
In the late Republic, the Romans also made strides in the area of glassmaking. To find out about this, we tracked down one of America's master glassmakers and historians.
The way that we work with glass is very similar to the way the Italians worked in the Renaissance. When they started back 2,000 years ago, they had a really limited palette of color. Lots of turquoise because it was readily available. Because of our modern technology, we have available to us over 300 different colors, both in transparent and opaque colors. The main difference between then and now is the sophistication in terms of the types of materials and tools we have. They had to bundle reeds and different types of wood in order to get certain temperatures. There's a guy in all the glass houses who was known as the bundler or the fireman, and they would know where to go in the forest to get the right kind of wood, some green, some old, and they would bundle it together, and then that's how they kept their temperature, because that guy knew just the right amount of wood and the right type of wood to put in there. Along with our furnace that holds the glass right in the middle there, we have these blast furnaces we call glory holes. They didn't have that capability back then. They had to do everything in and out of the furnace. And they probably had somebody hitting bellows, you know, it was a real team effort. 40 or 50 years BC is when they figured out how to make clay pipes that they could actually gather glass on the end and then inflate. So that was huge development. And then with the spread of the Roman Empire, in Roman times, the Romans were not allowed to work in the trades. They were special. So they farmed out all the glass blowing to Palestine, Lebanon, Israel, Cyprus, like that. All the glass blowing was done in Mesopotamia or in Palestine. And around 50 years AD is when they figured out how to blow into molds. Then they were able to pick up the pace. Then glass became like a utilitarian object in most people's homes.
So the 1st century BCE was a time of dynamic developments in art and politics in Rome. It ended with Octavian, now Augustus, firmly in control. And to look at the Rome that he made, you'll have to join us for the next lecture.